Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Mr. V. Okay, this is just the second video that we're going to be doing on PPFs. I've realised PPFs is one of those subjects that comes up really early on the course, but it's important to get it right. In the first video, which I think was episode 35, okay, we looked at why the PPF was curved. In this video, I just wanted to go through some of the nuts and bolts of PPFs, which I hope most of you are familiar with. So go and grab yourself a cup of coffee, and with me we are going to do the synchronized sip. 3, 2, 1, here we go. I love coffee. So PPFs, what we established in the first video then was that the PPF is often drawn as a curve. It doesn't ever really matter what you put on the axes, because it's always a hypothetical situation in any case. So in a question, in an exam, you might get told what's on the axes, but if you don't, I would normally go for something like manufacturing and agriculture on the two axes, just because one is a primary sector good and the other is tertiary sector. Sometimes you might see capital goods and consumer goods. Fine, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, as I say, if the examiner wants you to put specific things on the axes, then he or she will tell you to do that. So the PPF therefore acts like as a boundary. Basically, what it says is this is the maximum level of output that an economy can produce with its scarce resources. If, for example, this economy puts all of its resources into manufacturing goods, it would only be able to produce there. We can come up with a number if you want, 200 manufacturing goods, but 0 agricultural goods, because of course we haven't allocated any resources to our agricultural goods. On the other hand, if this economy puts all of its resources, all of its factors of production into agriculture and nothing into manufacturing, then you would be here. Okay, so these 2 points at the either extreme represent points of what we call specialization, when we have put all of our resources into a different industry. So maybe you get 200, and again, this is just a hypothetical number, maybe you get 200 manufacturing goods if you specialize in manufacturing goods. Maybe you get 1,000 units of agriculture if you put all of your resources into agriculture. And then this line then is essentially saying, well, there's a hypothetical number, an infinite number of different combinations of manufacturing goods to agricultural goods that this economy could make with its scarce resources. So it could be here, something like whatever that is, 100 agricultural goods and 190 manufacturing goods. It could be here, it could be here, it could be here, it could be here, it could be here. All right, so we'll take a random point. There, I mean, again, the numbers themselves don't really matter. I mean, that looks about 700 if we're using the same scale, and probably something like 140 there. So we can call that point C, A, B, and C. Okay, so the fact that line means that this economy could, with its scarce resources, just about make 140 manufacturing goods and 700 agricultural goods. What else do we know from the PPF? Well, we know that point, we could call it point D, at the moment is unobtainable for this economy. Why? Because it simply doesn't have enough resources. Okay, we can only make at a maximum 200 manufacturing goods when we put all of our resources there, and as a maximum 1,000 agriculture if we put all of our resources there. But there is no way at the moment, with the scarce resources that our economy has, that we could make 200 manufactured goods and 1,000 agricultural goods. Okay, in order to do that, actually, we'd need to have more resources. We need to have more factors of production, which we'll come to in a moment. But for now, it's unobtainable. And in fact, any points, not just D, it's that point, that point, that point, that point, that point. Any of those red points there are currently unobtainable, given the scarce resources that this country has. On the other hand, anything within the PPF, so we could talk about, I don't know, that point there, we could call it E. We know that that is very much obtainable, and not just that it's obtainable, but it's well within the capacity. Actually, we could make that combination of manufactured goods and agricultural goods and still have some left over, still have some resources left over. If you think about it, if you kind of visualize it a little bit, actually what it's meaning is that those resources are not being used to full capacity. They're not being used efficiently. They're not being used efficiently. Okay, so we call anything within the PPF an inefficient use of our resources. That is to say that they're not working at 100%. If they're all working and they're all working at 100%, then they would be on the blue line, on the PPF curve. So that, in a sense, is what the PPF as a concept, as a diagram, represents. And then the next questions from them are, well, what happens then when you increase the quantity or the quality of resources? I'll say that again, okay? What happens if you increase the quantity? And I did catch myself there saying it, the quality of resources, but I don't actually like using the word quality of resources. I know it does in some textbooks, but actually what I want to talk about is the productivity of resources, the quantity and or the productivity of resources. Quantity is just the raw number. So if you had 10 workers and you increased to 15 workers, that's a quantity issue. Productivity issue is the rate of output per resource, or in this case, per labor, per worker. So if you have 10 workers and they can all produce 10 pens per hour, okay, then that's 100 pens. If you have 10 workers, but you put them on a training course and they can all make 15 pens an hour, then that's 150 pens, okay? But did you see what the difference there? That's a productivity issue rather than a quantity issue. I kept the number of the labor the same, but it's just their rate of output, their productivity increased. Right, if any of one of those things happen, then suddenly you would be able to make both more manufacturing goods and more agricultural goods. So the PPF would shift outwards, and actually that point D may now become obtainable because we now have the resources to make point D, along with all of the other points that were kind of between those two PPF lines. Okay. If, on the other hand, random scenario, both the quantity and the productivity of resources decreased, then you would simply do the opposite. That actually the PPF would move inwards. In real life, yeah, that happens much less than the PPF shifting outwards. The PPF is shifting out pretty much all the time in real life because there is investment, people are buying more machinery, we have a positive birth rate, the population is increasing all the time. Okay, so in real life, we normally have the PPF moving outwards all the time, and that's economic growth. It very rarely shifts inwards. But when you have natural disasters, obviously that's the most obvious example of when things like that might happen, like a wartime scenario or a natural disaster. So those account for the two different shifts then in the PPF, outwards and inwards. But there's one other scenario that's just worth talking about. When you have a change in the quantity and or the productivity of resources that only affect one of the industries. So, for example, if there was an increase in the quantity of capital resources, machinery, that only affects the productivity of agriculture. Okay, I'll say that again. If you have an increase in the machinery or the technology of machinery that only affects agriculture, i.e. it helps us grow more crops, but it doesn't help us at all in the manufacturing, then what would happen is that the PPF would shift outwards to the right here on agriculture. So maybe we could make 1,500 units of agriculture now, but it has no effect on the maximum number of manufacturing goods that we can make. And you would get a skewed shift like that. So I'd normally talk about parallel shifts being the other movement when it affects both industries, or a skewed shift or a pivot shift like this when it only affects one industry. And of course, it could be the other way around. There's no reason why it couldn't just be something that affects manufacturing and not agriculture. So you could do it like that. And you could also, hypothetically, You could have inward skewed shifts as well. So if it was something that reduced the quantity or the productivity of resources, but it only had an effect on one of the industries, then you could have a skewed shift inwards. And that's it really, okay? So what we've been through there is we've been through why the PPF looks the way it does, okay? We've talked about what it means to be outside and inside the PPF. We've now talked about movements of the PPF as well. I guess one last thing that I'll leave you is just be careful, okay? The difference between movements along the PPF and movements of the PPF. So movement along the PPF, that's you reallocating your resources, or not necessarily you, the economy reallocating of resources. If it's a command economy, then it's very much a kind of a dictator or a government that is saying, well, we're moving our train set around, we're moving resources away from manufacturing so that there can be more agricultural goods. If it's the free market, then this has happened because of demand and supply market forces. On the other hand, if it's a shift of the PPF, then that's because of these issues here, the quantity and or the productivity of resources and factors of production have changed. So just be a bit careful of that. What is it a scenario in which you are moving along the PPF, or is it in a scenario in which you need to shift the PPF? Okay, right, that's it. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for coming along.